captured in a 1933 recording of Suicidio from Ponchielli's La Gioconda. Tonight's program deals with Rosa Raisa and her great soprano contemporaries, and is occasioned by the imminent appearance of a biography on the great soprano, written by Charles Mintzer, who's my guest here in the studio. And Charles, welcome to WMNR. We did it. Here we are.
Thank you very much.
And it's very exciting to be able to tell people about this great singer, because, as you pointed out, since her American career was centered in Chicago and not New York, many people today are not aware of her accomplishments.
That's true. A lot of people don't realize that operatic activity in America on the highest level was not only at New York's Metropolitan Opera, which of course is the premier theater, admittedly, and no question, but there was the Chicago Opera, which in its great glory days, when Raisa sang there, was a very, very important enterprise. Many, many famous singers. I'll just name 5 sopranos who are connected with the Chicago Opera: Raisa, Mary Garden, Amelita Galli-Curci, Claudia Muzio, and Edith Mason. And an opera company which would have those 5 sopranos, not all at the same time, but 3 at the same time, with a repertoire fashioned around those 3 remarkable, well, 5, but 3 at a given time, singers, would be world-class by any standard.
Now, Rosa Raisa was born in 1893 and died in 1963.
That's right, 70 years old.
And her career began at a young age.
Oh, yeah, she was one of those singers who made her first public appearances in 1912. She was born in 1893. She was 19 years old when she sang her first concerts in Rome. Her operatic debut was in September 1913 at the age of 20, and not singing small roles, but Aida, Masked Ball, Cavalleria Rusticana, very big roles. And some of the other singers that we're going to play tonight, her contemporaries, Rosa Ponselle, Emmy Destin, Elizabeth Rethberg, and Claudia Muzio, all started in their very early 20s, at about the same age as Raisa. So, nowadays a dramatic soprano matures and comes on the scene about when they're 30 years old. Well, 75, 80 years ago, some of them were 20 years old.
And they were great singers. And your book, Rosa Raisa, is about to be published by Northeastern University Press. And of course, it can be obtained from all of the major booksellers as well as online.
That's right. It should have its debut next week. Around Thanksgiving time, it'll be in the stores. Clearly, the publication date was geared towards the holidays. The title of the book is Rosa Raisa, A Biography of a Diva, with selections from her memoirs. It's an interesting concept. We have blended into her life story substantial excerpts from her unpublished memoirs that she was working on at the time of her death in 1963. Her family has given me permission to use the memoirs and her letters, so some of the important events in her life are cast in the first person.
Now, Charles, you really whet my appetite, so we've got to hear some more singing by this great artist. And you selected some of her acoustic recordings, and begin with Voi lo sapete from Cavalleria Rusticana.
Yeah.
And we'll follow that with, I believe, the Bolero from Vespri Siciliani.
Yes, and it's interesting because the Cavalleria shows the full dramatic soprano organ, and the Vespri Siciliani Bolero shows the her 19th century schooling in the where she exhibits her flora technique with an array of trills and leaps and runs. It's quite an amazing juxtaposition.
Well, let's hear it. And
now, the Cavalleria was recorded in 1918, and the Vespri Siciliani in 1920. In 1918, she would have been 25 years old. In 1920, 27 years old.
Okay. And as always, when music is on, feel free to call us with requests and comments 203-268-9667. We've just heard our featured artist, soprano Rosa Raisa, in two items, Voi sapete from Cavalleria and the Bolero from Verdi's Vespri Siciliani. And I'm going to let my guest, Charles Mintzer, who is the author of a forthcoming biography on this great dramatic soprano, take us again back to the topic. We're still awaiting phone calls. When music comes back on, feel free to call us at 203-268-9667 with requests and comments relating to Rosa Raisa. So, Charles, I know, of course, you've got a book's worth of information for us tonight.
Yes.
Your book is coming out very shortly from Northeastern University Press, Rosa Raisa, and I was fortunate enough to get a manuscript copy of it. The photographs alone are fascinating.
Oh,
They're
yes.
worth the price of the book.
There's 52 photographs in the book, many of them full page, and 35 of them, I believe, have never before been published in any form, and most of the photographs were from her own collection, as I had a relationship with her family in recent years, and I have had access to her papers and her photographs. People have asked me how I got interested in this fascinating soprano.
I was about to ask you that next.
I'm anticipating you, Doug.
Okay.
And what happened is I started going to the opera in 1951. I come from northern New England, and as a high school and college student, I used to come to New York on my Christmas and Easter vacations and in the spring recess. And I used to go to the opera every night at the Metropolitan, of course, as a young person on a limited budget as a standee. And there's a whole culture on the standing line. You meet all kinds of people. And in 1951 and 52, when our gods were Zinka Milanov, Mario Delmonico, Leonard Warren, and Cesare Siepi, what seemed to me then as much older people, but really these were people in their 30s and 40s, not really old at all, were telling us, well, yes, they're fine, these singers, but we heard Rosa Pansel, and we heard Elizabeth Rethberg and Giovanni Martinelli, De Luca, Pinza, and the implication of their comments was that, well, yes, what we have now is okay, but we were part of an even golden age, or a more golden age. And then I met men who were not that old, really, in their 50s and 60s, who were telling us about Caruso and Tito Ruffo. And a name that started to come up was Rosa Raisa. And I didn't know anything about her, really, except I had seen her name in some books, but it was just a name. And in those days, the New York Public Library used to be just a block and a half away from the old Metropolitan Opera on 5th Avenue and 40th Street, 42nd, between 40th and 42nd Street. And the music division was right on the 42nd Street side. And I used to spend hours at the music division going through newspaper files, clipping files, the old music magazines, Musical America, Musical Courier, and reading all about that wonderful period in American musical life. And there was a lot about Rosa Raisa. And I started copying by hand in those days because we didn't have Xerox machines or photocopiers. And I couldn't believe the language, the hyperbole, the praise that this woman received. And I realized that she was really a very, very important singer. And that started my journey. I started looking for more and more information. It was almost a compulsion to know everything I could about this woman.
Well, you've certainly done an effective job of conveying this knowledge to us, Charles, because I've read your book in manuscript, which is, I think, 99%.
Yeah, there's been some rewrites, but basically that's it.
And we know this singer was praised by her peers. For example, one of her biggest fans was Rosa Pansel, and I think later on you'll be giving us the details.
Oh yeah, they were a mutual admiration society.
The two Rosas.
Yes.
Two great American sopranos.
Well, Raisa was an adopted American. She was born in that part of Poland controlled by Russia in 1893, and came to America in 1913, and went back to Europe because of the war and different things, and came back to Chicago and United States in 1916 and launched her great career.
Now, among the things you're doing tonight is presenting some of her contemporary soprano greats, and one of these is Claudia Muzio.
Yes, well, you know, it's interesting.
You selected two items. Can I put them on?
Yes, I just want to make a point that Raisa and Muzio are so intertwined, both in Chicago and South America. They were the closest you could think of as rivals, where people had real favorites between them. And the two selections we're going to play right now are comparative versions of what we just played before. The Cavalleria Rusticana, recorded in 1918, and Muzio's version of the Bolero, also recorded in 1918.
The voice of Claudia Muzio, soprano contemporary of Rosa Raisa, in the Voi lo sapete from Cavalleria, and the Bolero from Verdi's Vespri Siciliani. Charles Mintzer, we've had a number of phone calls. Julio de la Torre says that he adores Rosa Raisa. Bob Saxon had a question for you. He wondered if you could compare Ponselle, Raisa, and Muzio in terms of their respective dramatic intensity of expression and the size of the voice from the knowledge that you have.
Oh boy, that's a tall order, because all three were very famous. I mean, I think it's clear that Ponselle and Raisa were true dramatic sopranos, and Muzio was a spinto verging on dramatic, had that ability to go. She was a very dramatic singer, but the weight of the voice, from everything I've heard in terms of the write-ups, was not of the same dimension of Raisa and Ponselle. Poncelle's voice, truly a great dramatic organ, was centered in the middle and the bottom, and her top kind of had a lid, whereas Raisa's voice was one of those very big on the top, big on the bottom, and not as rich sounding in the middle as Ponselle. So it's kind of an interesting study of dramatic sopranos where the strengths of the voices were. Ponselle would be the first to admit that Raisa had the great top. She said once that, she could sing high C's all day, and Ponselle clearly was not happy on that particular note. But the three sopranos are terrific, and any opera house or era that could boast those three was indeed a great era, and we can only envy the people in the teens, 20s, and 30s who had a regular feast of these three.
I think you had a call from Gordon Shaw. He had an anecdote.
Yeah, it was a wonderful story. He said that he is very distantly related to Raisa through an aunt's aunt or an uncle's aunt. He wasn't even clear exactly, but the other interesting story was that he had a friend who studied singing. It was a lyric baritone, went on to become a psychiatrist, but he had studied in Chicago with Raisa, and he said that she was a fiery woman, and that the lessons were conducted in a mix of Italian, English, and Yiddish.
So you had to be trilingual.
Trilingual, yes. In fact, I have seen many of her letters, and she goes into English and Italian almost with total ease. And of course, I've seen examples of her writing in Yiddish, but of course I couldn't read it. It's been translated for me. And she could also write Russian, Cyrillic.
Did she speak Polish, or was she a Russian speaker in Poland?
No, that's very interesting. Raisa was born in Białystok, and Białystok is in the eastern part of what is now Poland, but was at the time she came on the scene in the sector controlled by the Russians. And the Jews in Białystok tended, not all, but tended to gravitate to the Russian culture. So in her home, the family spoke Yiddish, but she and her siblings went to Russian language schools, and she was fluent in both Russian and Yiddish, and she knew Hebrew for prayer. she was very famous for all her languages, and actually she was only really good in Italian, Russian, I presume Yiddish, and she speaks wonderful English, but it's very heavily accented.
Now, we appreciate these calls, and we hope that people will keep calling us, and music goes back on 203-268-9667. We have some additional material for you, and this gets into the Yiddish language that you just mentioned. Can you tell us about this, Charles?
Yes. Raisa came from a Yiddish-speaking background in Bialystok, and in 1906 there were horrible pogroms which convulsed the city, and that's an important factor because within a year she emigrated. She left Poland, and whereas her older sister Sonia and brother Moishe went to the United States, she went to Italy following a cousin who was a revolutionary, or accused of being a revolutionary, but who actually was just a middle-class dentist. And he was imprisoned and sent to Siberia, and then the way things happened, then he ended up allowed to leave Russia, and he went to Italy and settled on the island of Capri, with a lot of other Russians, including Gorky, who was a friend of theirs.
Yes, there's a photo you have of them with Gorky, right?
Oh, yeah. In 1930, of course, this is many years later after Raisa was well into her career. There's a picture of Dr. Vigdorchik, her cousin, and Gorky and herself, yes.
Now, I want to get back into some of this material that you mentioned because, as you pointed out, it's very important understanding her. Presumably, if she hadn't lived in this horrible era of pogroms, she never would have gone to Italy.
That's right.
Probably would have stayed right there in
she would
the
have
Polish
stayed there,
part of the Russian Empire.
Or she would have gone to America, as many people in those days were. They were leaving Poland and coming to the United States, and she may have ended up working in a garment factory, and even with her great voice, maybe wouldn't have been discovered. Now, granted, there's no guarantee that going to Italy, your great voice is going to be discovered, but it happened that way, and it almost has a fairy tale quality, the fact that just within months of her arriving in Capri, she was invited with her cousins to an outdoor gathering, and she was asked to show off her voice because it was already said that she had this remarkable, very large voice, and a very wealthy young couple, the Ascarellis, Esther and Dario Ascarelli, were so impressed that they said that they were going to make some contacts in Naples with some influential people in the music world to hear her and to evaluate whether she had the stuff, to make a career. And of course, she was only 14 years old, but it must have been quite awesome. And the only song she knew from the Western musical literature was the Elegy of Massenet, which she never recorded. And she knew, of course, some Russian and Yiddish songs. That was it.
Well, Charles, if I could come in here, I'd like to hear some of these Yiddish songs. One is the Eli Eli, which is a prayer.
Well, it's it's Eli Eli, the Hebrew, meaning my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And then it ends with the Hebrew prayer Shema Yisrael. But the narrative in the middle is in Yiddish, saying that, God, what have you done to us? We kept. They burned us, they pillaged us, but we kept the faith. We always were true to you. And then it goes into the Hebrew credo, Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And the other song we're going to play was recently discovered. It was never issued. It's a little Yiddish song called Eufen Pripyatchek, By the Fireplace. It's a simple little song, nothing operatic or showy about it, but its rarity is incredible because it was only discovered about a year and a half ago.
Yeah, by the way, we're using for almost all our recordings of Rosa Raisa tonight this definitive 3-CD set from Marston, Rosa Raisa, the complete recordings, which of course you had a hand in, very heavy hand.
My hand is heavy?
Yeah, well,
Thank you.
I'm not at my most eloquent tonight, so, but the idea is that you were the major actor here, and this is Marston 53001-2. But let's put these two items on. We've just heard our featured artist, soprano Rosa Raisa, in two Jewish songs. The first was the prayer like Eli Eli, and the second one translate to the cricket on the hearth? Or
No, by the fireplace.
By the fireplace. So I moved.
Yes, same idea.
I moved in the cricket as well. Now, with me here, I'm Doug Fox, your host on Fine Arts Radio's Evening at the Opera, and we'll be here until midnight, another 3 hours and 13 minutes. My guest tonight is Charles Mintzer, the author of a definitive new biography of this great dramatic soprano, Rosa Raisa, which is about to be published by Northeastern University Press. I have read the book in manuscript, a manuscript which included the photos, and I'm telling you folks that this would be an ideal holiday present for any friends or relatives who are opera fanatics, as we all are who listen to this program. Charles, please elaborate.
Yes, well, the book has a long story behind it. I mentioned before that I started almost 50 years ago looking into this, what was then just, for me, a name, and later became more than a name, but...
You must have been pretty precocious if you were doing this stuff 50 years ago.
Oh, yeah, well...
You were a teenager.
Well, I'm well preserved, I guess. Yeah, I started working on it, and at a very early time, I started writing to people who had written beautifully about Raisa. Vincent Sheen, the great war correspondent, who was a great opera lover, wrote a book called The First and Last Love, which came out in the mid-50s, and his remembrances of Raisa were so lavish that I wrote to him, care of his publisher, and he answered me and told me that he started going to the opera as a college student in Chicago around World War I. He was an usher at the Chicago Opera, and he heard everybody from, he heard Galli Curci at her debut, Raisa, Mary Garden, many performances. And I then wrote to Paul Hume, the music critic of the Washington Post, who had written on the record jacket of a compendium that he had put together called Critics' Choice. RCA had asked Irving Collodin and Paul Hume to select some of their favorite records and to then elaborate. Raisa's La Gioconda, the suicide aria, on, and he said in the notes that Raisa's was the greatest voice he ever heard. Well, that really was pretty heady stuff for this youngster.
That sparked your interest.
And I wrote to him, and he just wrote me a 6-page letter just pouring it all out, everything he knew about her, and he was clearly a great fan. And I wrote to Claudia Cassidy, the famous critic of the Chicago Tribune, and I framed my letter to her as, you've written all these wonderful things about her, and I've read so many terrific things, but the recordings don't quite match the praise. And the first line, I'll never forget it, of her letter was, yes, she said Raisa was that good. And she just went on and elaborated that it was a huge voice of wonderful warmth and color, I think was the phrase she used. And she also then described that the voice belonged not only to this marvelous artist, but to a marvelous woman, warm and outgoing. And for Cassidy, I remember the clincher was, she said at the end of the letter, oh, you might be interested, Mr. Mintzer. She was also a great admirer of Maria Callas. Now, if you know anything about Callas in operatic history, Claudia Cassidy in Chicago wrote the reviews that kind of put Callas on the American map. Callas made her debut in, I think it was 1954, in Norma. And Cassidy pulled out all the stops. And to Cassidy, you know, a plus on Raisa was that she liked Callas. And since opera history today seems to revolve a lot around Maria Callas, take that for whatever it's worth. But anyhow, I wrote to Hume, Sheehan, and Cassidy. And in 1962, on the Metropolitan Opera broadcast of Turandot, Raisa was the guest, and she was interviewed by John Gutman. And I had never written to anybody famous, like a movie star or an opera star, but I wrote her a letter, care of Texaco, and I didn't know if they get these letters or what happens, but about a month later, I got the most beautiful handwritten letter from Raisa, and she said in the letter, I'll never forget the expression, "You know about me more than I do myself," that in her kind of broken English. And I had included with the letter a list of all her recordings that I had at that time knew about, and I had discovered 43 of her 49 rolls, and she annotated the lists, and after one of the recordings, the aria from L'Africana, she said, "This I never recorded." Well, she clearly did record it, she just forgot. And she crossed out a couple of the rolls that I had mentioned, and she added some more, and we became correspondents. I started writing to her, and unfortunately she died shortly after, but that was all pretty heady for a youngster.
Indeed. Now, Charles, we already mentioned Rosa Poncell, and we did have a request for Rosa Poncell from Ellen de la Torre, and you selected...
Pace Pace from Forza del Destino, her debut opera at the Met when she was 20 years old, and Ernani Involami from the opera Ernani, which was one of her early roles at the Met. And I selected these because Raisa made versions of these arias too. I'm not going to suggest that they're better or even as good as the Poncell, but they'll be interesting to hear a little while later, and some of the vocal placement issues that I mentioned before may become evident.
Good. Well, we'll continue. We'll put these on right now. And again, do call us with your requests and comments relating to Rosa Raisa. Well, we've just heard the other Rosa, Connecticut's own Rosa Poncell in Pace Pace from Forza, and Ernani Involami from Ernani, and Charles Mintzer, author of the new biography on Rosa Raisa. We've had some more calls and questions for you. Diana Mastroni really likes Rosa Raisa. This is an eye-opener for a lot of listeners who are not familiar with this singer, which we intended.
Well, I think my book will pique even more interest. There's a lot of things in the book. Her memoir is integrated into the book, and I have a wonderful collection or selection of reviews, some very, very purple, all-out raves, and others more qualified. And I think the reviews give a sense of the impact she had on critics and audiences.
Well, one thing I like about your book, Charles, among many, is the fact that it's not just
it's not
this mindless adulation.
Oh, no.
You point out that there was some criticism. You point out certain weaknesses, and
yes,
the fact that the career ended relatively early.
Well, you know, she wound down after 25 years, 24 to be more exact, and the last 5 years were on a lesser plane than the rest of the career because of the bankruptcy of the Chicago Opera and the status of opera in America and in Europe at that time. Because in the book I have a very interesting section, a chronology of every one of her performances, the dates, cast, the theaters, and she sang a lot, believe me. She had almost 1,000 operatic appearances and a couple hundred concerts, and they're all pointed out with interesting information integrated into the chronology. And as a student of careers, that many performances, plain and simple, whether it's over a period of 40 years or 25 years or 20 years, is a lot of singing. And I don't think she had anything to be ashamed about in terms of how much she sang.
Oh, I didn't mean that.
No, not at all. It's just that
too.
people ask, because you see, nowadays, a dramatic soprano at age 45 would just be hitting their prime because they start later than they did in Raisa's day. They go to college now, and they study theory and history, and singers today have a wonderful academic background for the most part. And in Raisa's day, you started as a teenager at the conservatory, and at age 20, you went out on the stage in big roles. Now, dramatic sopranos oftentimes start in lighter roles and work and develop the voice to the dramatic parts. And therefore, Raisa did retire when she was 45 years old. And dramatic sopranos today at age 45 should be in about the midpoint of their career. But, careers are all different. And Raisa's career kind of parallels what happened in the 19th century. Most singers started at about 20 sopranos, and most were retired before they were 50 years old. There were exceptions, of course, like Patti, but for the most part, I think that's accurate.
Well, now, Charles, we have some more Raisa, and I believe it's the same items we just heard Poncell sing.
Yeah, we're going to, one of the callers wanted some direct comparisons between the two Rosas, and so we're going to play Raisa's Pace Pace and Ernani and Volami. The Forza was recorded, I'm pretty sure, 1921, and the Ernani in 1923.
And do call us again, requests and comments relating to Rosa Raisa and her great soprano contemporaries, 203-268-9667. Of our featured artist tonight, soprano Rosa Raisa, whose dates are 1893 to 1963, in Pace Pace from Forza del Destino and Ernani and Volami from Ernani, both operas of Verdi. Her biographer, Charles Mintzer, is my guest tonight. His book is coming out very shortly from Northeastern University Press, Rosa Raisa. And Charles, I know you just took a call. Anything to report?
Well, the caller sort of knew a little bit about Raisa, but was really quite impressed with the selections that we played so far, and we had a very nice chat. People, the opera world has several different layers, and in Raisa's day, there was the Chicago, Metropolitan, and Covent Garden, London, representing one of the levels of opera, and then there was the South American and the Eastern European axis, and Raisa, of course, on the first axis had been in London for a season, and Chicago, of course, and she also had very heavy experience in South America. And of course, one of the icons of opera in London and in America was the Australian soprano Nellie Melba. Now, Melba heard Raisa at the Chicago Opera in 1916, and she heard her in Aida. And in those days, after a superb rendering of an aria, they gave encores, and she had to encore the Nile aria, O Patria Mia. And Melba was very impressed and invited Raisa to tea the next day. And here's a quote. I have this little story in the book. Raisa, this is from her memoir. Maestro Campanini made me repeat Patria Mia. The great Melba lauded my pianissimos in the third act, saying, always use them. Luckily, your repetition of the aria came out even better, if that's possible, than the first rendition. It's best to avoid such repetitions. Too difficult an aria to take any chances with. However, in the duet with Radames, you sang pianissimi that sounded like a Stradivarius. You should use them as often as you can. And apropos her meeting with Melba, Raisa then sort of adds this, that 2 nights later she heard Melba in La Boheme. And this is her quote, I still remember her exit on the high C with McCormick, when their singing glittered like beautiful gems. In the third act, when she sings Addio senza rancore, the last F was so beautiful that it still rings in my ears. What is interesting is that she remembers the Melba Boheme performance with McCormick, but my research has indicated that that was not possible. There's no way that Raisa could have heard Melba and McCormick. They never sang together any place where she could have been at the same time. Probably she heard him, the tenor in the Bohème was either Amedeo Bassi or Giulio Crimi. But we're going to play now Melba's famous recording of the first act duet with Caruso, with whom Raisa sang in London in 1914 in Aida, and in South America in Aida also at the Colón Theater in Buenos Aires.
And you also wanted to play by Caruso the aria from Lo Schiavo?
Yeah,
Gomes?
that's an interesting story. In 1921, Raisa was singing in South America, a big season, and in the Brazilian portion of the tour, in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, they did this opera Lo Schiavo by the Portuguese or Brazilian composer Gomes, and we know very little about that opera now, but it was sort of popular, certainly in the Portuguese world. And although Raisa didn't sing it in Portuguese, she sang it in Italian. She often would point to Caruso's recording of the tenor aria as an example of the beauties of that opera.
I have a question here from Helen Mestrov, and I wonder if you can answer it
Sure.
quickly. If you can't, maybe we'll tackle it when we go back on mic, Charles. She asked the big question. Here's Rosa Raisa holding forth in Chicago all those years. Why didn't Rosa Raisa sing at the Met? Do you want to take that now,
Sure.
or do you want to do it later?
No. The Met had invited her on 2 or 3 occasions and offered her very, as she said, tempting contracts. But early in her career, she was so dedicated to Cleofonte Campanini, who had discovered her and gave her first opportunities with his Chicago-Philadelphia Opera, that she wouldn't even consider leaving the Chicago Opera for the Met. And the Chicago Opera used to, starting in 1918, tour North America. And Raisa sang very often in New York with the Chicago Opera at the Lexington Theater and later at the Manhattan Opera House. She did her Norma, Jules and the Madonna, Aida, Gioconda, Sor Angelica, Girl of the Golden West, Tannhäuser, Otello, Tosca. She sang, I believe my count is 31 opera performances in New York over those 5 seasons. And she also sang concerts in New York, 36 or 37 of them, many of them at the Hippodrome Theater, which was a huge amphitheater-type auditorium on 6th Avenue and 43rd Street. They used to present concerts for the masses, and she sang, I think 13 times at the Hippodrome, many times at Carnegie Hall. And in those days, there was the phenomena of the morning musicale, where society women would go into a hotel ballroom like the Biltmore or the Waldorf, and big-name artists like Caruso and DeLuca and Ponsell and Raisa would give concerts. So she sang often in New York, but not at the Met. That's true. But Rosa Ponsell of the Met, in fact, Ponsell remembers that in 1918, early 1918, Raisa was present when she auditioned for Gatti Casazza. Raisa was in the audience, so
something was going on.
Yeah, I mean, now, and Ponsell in interviews over the years is very, very specific about that. And the gentleman who wrote her biography, James Drake, footnotes that anecdote, questioning it. I mean, could it be? I mean, this doesn't compute or add up. And Robert Tuggle, the archivist of the Met, with whom I've discussed this issue, is almost certain that it couldn't have happened that way. That's just not the way the world worked. But Ponsell was, in at least 4 or 5 interviews, doggedly mentions that Raisa and, at that time, her eventual husband Rimini were in the audience, sitting, in the same row with Gatti Casazza when she made her audition. So it's a little bit of history.
Well, it's a mystery. Let's put the Melba and Caruso items on.
Sure.
And invite listeners to keep calling 203. We heard 2 of the greats of the past. First from La Boheme, Puccini, O Suave Panciulla, Nelly Melba, and Enrico Caruso. And then Caruso in Quando Nascesti Tu from the composer Gomez's Lo Schiavo, the slave. Charles Mintzer.
Yes, there's a wonderful story about Schiavo. As I said before, they did this Portuguese language opera in Italian in Brazil in 1921. And Raisa, in her memoir, which is quoted in the book, talks about them while they were in Rio, they got the telegram. This was in August 1921 that Caruso had died. And then she does a whole thing about how much Caruso meant to her, how they were friends. And just before they went to South America that year, they had visited him in New York. She said at the Waldorf, but research has indicated that it couldn't have been the Waldorf, it had to be the Vanderbilt. There are these kinds of memory lapses, but
anyone who relies on a 40-year-old memory is bound to get in trouble.
Yeah, but nevertheless, it's a wonderful story. And she also recalled that when she sang with Caruso in 1915 in Buenos Aires, his hotel room at the Plaza Hotel was on the same floor as hers, and she could hear him rehearsing with his, I think it was Maestro Bartolome. He was preparing Samson and Delilah, which he was going to sing for the first time at the Met that fall. And he was learning the role, and she heard him rehearsing in the bathtub. You know, walking down the corridor, she could hear him in his room. And
don't you wish you could have been walking down that corridor, Charles?
Oh, God. And then she recalled also that Caruso used to invite her to sit with him on the mezzanine and listen to these Argentine tangos together. And one day after he had sung Monolesco, not with her, but with, I think, Della Rizza, she said to him, you know, you must be the happiest man in the world. He said, everybody loves you. You're just, and here you're just a god. And he said that happiness was not to be his, that the woman he adored, the mother of his child, had left him.
Giacchetti.
Yes, yeah. So there is a lot of, I guess that could be considered name dropping in her memoir, but I've put these things in the book because they have a nice period feel, and you get some sort of measure of the person.
Yes, and these connections are
yes.
Very important.
Oh, yes. Another singer that she sang often with was Giovanni Martinelli. She sang with him in London in 1914. In 1916, a big season in South America, many times with him, at the Ravinia Festival outside Chicago in the summer of 1925, and her very last operatic appearance at the Chicago Opera in 1937 in La Juive. Of course, Rachel was one of her great roles. For many reasons, she had was considered definitive in that role. And Martinelli, of course, was at that time the great Eliezer, at least outside of France. And we're going to be playing in a little while Martinelli in the Miserere duet with Emma Destin, recorded, I think, in 1916. And then we'll play later Raisa's version of the aria, of the duet with tenor Armand McCutcheon.
Now, first you were going to play Destin with Caruso. And
yes.
What was the item?
Guarni, the
new biography of Rosa Raisa, which is just about to come out from Northeastern University Press.
Doug,
yes.
While we were playing records before, Lynn Stroh, the soprano, called and put forth an interesting theory that possibly the reason why dramatic sopranos like Raisa and Poncel stopped their careers in their mid-40s, early to mid-40s, whereas nowadays that's mid-career, is because of hormone replacement therapy. And I just am not expert on this, but she explained it in a very interesting way. And do you have any ideas about that, Doug? It's the first time I had heard that theory put forward.
Well, Lynn is a frequent guest here, and she's expressed that point of view before. uh,
Well, it's an interesting idea.
yes, but I don't know how we can prove it at this remove.
No.
So let's put on Destin, Caruso, and Martinelli. This is going to be a treat. And we're approaching the halfway mark. It's 12 minutes of 10.
Well, time flies.
But, well, when you're having fun,
Thank you.
as we are tonight in this program on the great soprano Rosa Raisa. And let's see, whither now, Charles? Where are we headed now? What would you like to bring up? You have so much to tell us.
Well, the Trovatore was a good segue because Raisa recorded the Miserere twice, with first with Giulio Crimi and then with a few years later with Armand McCutcheon. And it's an interesting rendition of the Miserere because she takes with great ease the optional high C at towards the end of the opera. I don't think Destin took that high C, and it's optional, so I'm not knocking Destin. It's just for comparative sake. And then, very interestingly, we haven't talked about Giacomo Rimini, but you can't talk about Rosa Raisa and not mention a lot about Giacomo Rimini, who was her husband. They met in 1915. She was introduced to him. He was singing Falstaff at the Del Verme Theater in Milan, and Toscanini was the conductor, was giving a big season at the Milan Second Theater. She was introduced to Rimini, and it was like love at first sight. Rimini was not free to marry Raisa because he was married and had a child, although he wasn't living with his wife and daughter. He supported them. And only in 1920, 5 years after they first met, was he free legally to marry Raisa, and that he did in the United States. But from the time they met until the end of their careers, it was virtually a joint career. Her contract at the Chicago Opera and all the other theaters insisted that they take Rimini. And that could have been one of the reasons why after 1920 or so, the Met was not interested at all, if they had been interested at that time, because by 1920, Poncelle had already made her splash. Yuritsa was to come in, and Muzio was still in New York. She later went to Chicago 2 years later. Anyhow, their romance and their joint career was much written about, and almost all of Raisa's concerts were joint concerts with Rimini. And interestingly enough, for a dramatic soprano, very often she ended the first half of the recital. She and Rimini would sing the duet from either Louisa Miller or Don Pasquale. And the end of the recital, the printed portion, before the encores, they would do the duet from Trovatore, Mira da Cerbe. And she recorded it 3 times. We're going to play the first recording of it from 1923. She later made a Vitaphone film of the complete duet. The recording just is like the 2 sections of it without the recitative and the middle section. And then she recorded it in 1929 for Brunswick Records. So we're going to play now the Vocalion from 1923 with Armand McCutcheon and the duet with Rimini, also from 1923, Mira da Cerbe Lagrime.
We're at 203-268-9667. It's Rosa Raisa and her great soprano contemporaries. We'd love to get your requests and comments. Listening to soprano Rosa Raisa and I should mention that with one exception, all the Raisa items played tonight are from a 3D Marston set, Rosa Raisa, the complete recordings, Marston 53001-2. And we've just heard the great soprano in the Miserere from Trovatore with Armand McCutcheon, and the Act 4 Mira da Cerbe Lagrime with the baritone Giacomo Rimini, who was her husband. Charles Mintzer, we are at the halfway mark in our program based on your forthcoming biography of Rosa Raisa, being published by Northeastern University Press, will soon be available in bookstores and online.
Yes, it's all very exciting. And of course, Raisa is, if she's known at all today by non-specialist lovers of opera history, is because she was the creator of Turandot. And there's a wonderful story about how all that happened. In 1924, Toscanini had invited Raisa to sing at La Scala in the posthumous production of Nerone of Boito. Boito had died, and Toscanini, on his deathbed, had promised Boito that he would give the opera Nerone. And it was a big spectacle of the early Roman history. And Toscanini was a son of a gun. At one of the early rehearsals, Puccini had slipped into the theater. He wanted to hear some of the new opera. And Toscanini went into a rage and ordered him to leave the theater. It was his policy, nobody, even Puccini, should hear the opera before the last rehearsal at which the Milanese, the opera establishment in Milan, would be invited to. Raisa escorted Puccini to the stage door exit. And Puccini said to Raisa, he had already heard some of the first scenes, and Raisa has a big scene at the beginning of the opera. He said to her, Raisa, I am writing Turandot, and it's a role I can just see you and hear you. Now that's Raisa's paraphrase. And I want you to be the one to create it. And she said to him, somewhat playfully, after he told her that the opera was pretty much completed except the final duet, and she said to him, Maestro, be sure to put in plenty of high Cs. And as you could hear from those two Trovatore excerpts before, high C was for Raisa a very easy note. Now here the story gets a little murky because Maria Gerli of the Met had been telling the press for a few years that Puccini had promised her the title role Turandot of his new opera. And it's clear that Puccini, as early as 1921 in Vienna, had said to Gerli that for my next opera, you are the inspiration. And for many years, there were all these charges back and forth for whom Puccini wrote Turandot. Well, of course, Gerli clearly was the inspiration, but when Puccini heard Raisa, he felt he had heard the perfect Turandot voice. And in 1924, Puccini was still alive. In early October, 7 weeks before he died, the world press was told that Turandot would be given at La Scala, this is Puccini's new opera, the following year, 1925, in the spring, and that the cast was to be Raisa, Edith Mason of the Chicago Opera was to be Liu, and Gerli was the first nomination for Caliph, and Rimini was to do the baritone role Ping with Toscanini conducting. And that was all set, fixed, and established before Puccini had died. I have in the book some very rare documentation, not so much to prove the point, but to just add to opera history and opera lore as to for whom how the original cast came about. Now, there is the issue of opera politics, because if the Metropolitan, which was bidding for the rights of Turandot, had achieved the world premiere, then it would have been Gerli, of course. But in 1924, when Puccini was still alive, and with what was going on in Italy in terms of nationalism, and it would be unthinkable for a new Puccini opera to have its world premiere anywhere but at La Scala. And therefore, the plume went to Raisa. And of course, what happened is, Gerli, we're talking about son of a guns, Gatti Casazza had a thing about Toscanini. At that time, he and Toscanini were feuding, and Gerli was already well established at the Metropolitan, and Gatti threatened any of his singers that if they accepted an engagement at La Scala, they could kiss the Metropolitan goodbye. So Gerli in addition to feeling whether the role was right for him in terms of the heaviness, he wasn't about to force the issue with Gatti Casazza, so he declined. Both Martinelli and Lori Volpe, over the years, have said that they were positive that they had been promised the Caliph role, and they would have been in the same problem as Gerli in defying Gatti Casazza if they had appeared at La Scala while also singing in the winter in New York. Ultimately, Miguel Fleta, the Spanish tenor, was selected for the Caliph. Now, Fleta had sung at the Metropolitan, but he wasn't as quite as connected to the institution, I would say, as Gerli, Martinelli, and Lori Volpe were at that time. And Miguel Fleta in 1925 was a very, very hot tenor property. So it was a very glamorous choice. Fleta had a very glamorous voice, and we will be hearing him shortly. But I think the first selection, Doug, that we thought we'd play was Antonio Cortes, the Spanish tenor who was a mainstay at the Chicago Opera, sang very often with Raisa and Muzio. And he's going to sing the first act aria, and then we're going to play a Miguel Fleta selection.
You picked the flower song.
The flower song, yes.
In Italian.
He sings it in Italian. So first we're going to hear Antonio Cortes, and then the other Spanish tenor, Fleta, who actually sang with Raisa in the famous Turandot premiere. Very interestingly, Antonio Cortes, from 1924 to the demise of the Chicago Opera in 1932, sang often with Raisa and often with Muzio. In Chicago, they had a dramatic tenor who sang very often with Raisa because of the dramatic repertoire, Charles Marshall, very famous in his day as Otello, Radames, those kind of roles, and never made a recording.
Yeah, that's the sad thing I was going to say.
Yeah,
where are the records?
If you were to look at the chronology of the Chicago Opera and see how frequently Marshall sang, you can tell from the repertoire that it must have been quite a voice, but again, no recordings. And this happened very often with the Chicago singers. For example, Mary Garden, one of the very most famous singers ever, only made a handful of recordings. Raisa, ultimately there are 54 published sides, spanning 1917 to 1933. My theory is that the Chicago Opera, in terms of publicity, didn't have the cachet that the Metropolitan did, and the big recording companies who were headquartered in New York made their decisions on recordings as to who was singing at the Met. It's as simple as that, and I don't think it means much more. Also, in those days, recordings didn't mean what they do today, where virtually everything every singer does has been either taped privately or commercially. It just didn't happen in those days. It's just one of those things. We were talking before about Raisa's concerts, most of them with Rimini. She usually sang as encores, arias, Russian and Yiddish folk songs, and she did make 3 recordings of 3 Russian songs, Kalinka, Night, and of course the Tchaikovsky Number the Lonely Heart. And on the label of the recording, the old 78 RPM recording, it says, "Ye who have yearned alone." These were recorded in 1921. In almost all her programs, she sang as an encore, and sometimes on the printed program, Lisa's big aria from Peak Dam. And there's a wonderful little story. She recalled that in 1912, before she had made her professional debut, she was brought to from Naples, where she was studying at the conservatory. She was brought back to Capri to audition for Schaljapin, who was visiting his friend Gorky on Capri, and she remembered singing for him Lisa's aria from Pique Dame, and of course this is one of the additional, what I call might-have-beens. We have no recording of it, and yet she was very famous for her rendering of that aria. And her recorded career is full of might-have-beens. For example, we were just talking about Turandot. Not a note of her Turandot exists on recordings. Can you imagine a new important opera being premiered today and not having recordings, either private or commercial? It just wouldn't happen.
Yeah, it's a shame, and of course the same holds true for Fleta.
Yeah, not a note of. We do have Maria Zamboni, who was when Mason was not able to sing Liu because she was pregnant. They cast Maria Zamboni, a very important La Scala soprano, as Liu, and she did record Liu's two arias. So we have something from the premiere cast. But I believe, Doug, we're going to listen to Raisa singing Kalinka, Night, and None But the Lonely Heart.
That's it. And our number is 203-268-9667. Charles Mintzer, the author of the new biography of Rosa Raisa, published by Northeastern University Press, has come up from New York, and the phones are quiet now, but he'd love to hear from you, any questions and requests you have relating to Raisa and her recordings and those of her contemporaries. The songs by Rosa Raisa, Kalinka, Nochenko, and Niet Tolka Tot Kto Znal of Tchaikovsky, None But the Lonely Heart. Calls have come in. You have some to report, don't you, Charles?
Yeah, Al Scott called and has been listening to the program for quite a long time over the years. And he said this term that we use, dramatic soprano, coloratura soprano, lyric soprano, what is the difference? And, you know, we opera lovers, we use these terms because we sort of know what they mean instinctively, but I gave Al a very sort of like a snapshot. Raisa clearly is a dramatic soprano, and that has to do with the weight of the voice, the color, and the heft and the style, the dramatic style of the singing.
She's got the biggest, most powerful kind of soprano voice.
Yeah, and there are a lot of period accounts that talk about how her volume was apparently incredible, and she was not a big woman. She was 5'4" at most, and on the slender side. Although she was always fighting the battle of the waistline, she was mostly successful.
She's a very attractive woman if you look at these photos, and if I may quote from Bernardo de Muro's daughter, Dina Daly speaks, she met Raisa. She said she was beautiful, curvaceous, and beguiling, with a gorgeous voice, fully Italian.
Yeah.
So she certainly knows wherever she speaks.
Yes, because Raisa sang with her father, Bernardo de Muro, in that wonderful season in South America in 1915. After Raisa and Caruso sang the first two Aidas, the next five were with de Muro. And they also sang in La Fricana together with a very interesting cast. A very young Hina Spani, the Argentine soprano, was the Inez. De Muro sang the Vasco da Gama, and Tito Ruffo sang the big baritone role. So from a record collector point
That's
of view,
a cast to die for.
Or people who are fanciers of opera history, just seeing all those names in juxtaposition is mouth-watering, and we have no idea what the performance actually sounded like, but we can sort of let our imagination soar. And Yes, that is a very, very lovely quote from De Mauro's daughter. But getting back to the voice categories, for example, Claudia Muzio sings in a very dramatic way, and the weight of her voice would suggest she was borderline dramatic soprano, but generally thought of to be spinto, which is the category not of quality but of weight of voice, bordering on the dramatic. And then Al Scott said, well, what is Lily Pons? And I said, well, you wanted the definition of a coloratura soprano. Well, that Lily Pons would fit that definition, although in the 19th century and early 20th century, there were no distinctions. Dramatic sopranos were expected to be able to sing coloratura, or the voice to be, in addition to being dramatic, to be flexible. Not Lily Pons flexible, but flexible. Lily Pons is clearly a very high, light soprano who could do all the turns and the runs and the leaps. Interestingly, apropos Muzio and Raisa, and we're going to be playing something of Elizabeth Rethberg coming up. When Muzio came to the Chicago Opera in 1923, one of the headlines after her debut was that she was the best Italian-born Aida. Now, sounds like a perfectly lovely compliment. Within that compliment, there is a slight edge. By stressing her Italian birth, they're in effect saying, well, she's the best Italian-born Aida, and the implication in Chicago, for those who could read the diplomacy in that, Raisa was Italian-trained but not Italian-born. The American opera historian Charles Jahant, in an article in the Saturday Review in the early 1950s about Muzio, said that, for example, at the Chicago Opera, in the role of Aida, he said if you wanted a voice of phenomenal power and dramatic sweep, you went with Raisa, and if you wanted an Aida sung with simplicity, delicacy, and warmth, you went to Muzio. And that sort of, and of course both are valid ways to perform Aida. We thought that although Elizabeth Rethberg is not oftentimes thought of like Muzio, Ponselle, and Destin connected to Raisa, she was born about the same time, also made her debut very young, but was, in America at least, totally a Metropolitan Opera singer, although, it's coming back to me, for 10 years, every summer, she sang at the Ravinia Festival outside of Chicago. And in some of the reviews that I've looked at, talking about implications, in reviewing Rethberg and talking about her excellencies or things she didn't have, usually the implication was, if you understood the geography and how the reviewers worked then, they were oftentimes comparing her to Raisa. And we're going to play Rethberg's 1924 recordings of the two Aida arias, Act 1, Ritorno Vincitor, and Act 3, O Patria Mia.
And keep the calls coming when music is on, folks, to 203-268-9667. Your requests for items by Rosa Raisa and her soprano contemporaries, as well as any questions for Charles Mintzer, author of the forthcoming biography of Raisa to be published very soon by Northeastern University Press. Soprano Elizabeth Rethberg in the two arias of Aida from Verdi's opera. Charles Mintzer, you have many things to relate about Rosa Raisa.
Well,
and your book is coming out.
Yes, it's coming out next week. Around Thanksgiving time, it should be in the shops and online.
And again, remember, no less an authority than Doug Fox is recommending this as the perfect holiday present.
Oh, thank you.
For the opera fanatic in your life.
Thank you.
Or fanatics.
Apropos Aida, we're now going to play Raisa in the same two arias, recorded about the same time that Rethberg did, and since they're born a year apart, they're about the same age. However, in 1923, Raisa had sung Aida, I think, about close to 130, 40 times. She sang Aida 175 times in her career, and on 12 different occasions, she did the Nile scene or the triumphal scene in gala performances where they would have different artists, or the companies that she performed in. For example, in Chicago every year they had a gala towards the end of the season. It was a big society event, and there would be a Muzio, an act of an opera featuring Muzio, an act featuring Mary Garden, an act featuring Edith Mason, and Raisa. And in several of those galas, she did the Nile scene from Aida. There was a very famous Wagnerian soprano in her day, not well known today, Elsa Olsen, who used to be a frequent attendee at the New York Vocal Record Collectors Society. And Olsen had sung at the Chicago Opera in the mid-20s, and she told me with great enthusiasm that in the Nile aria, O Patria Mia, for the high C, Raisa would take the note pianissimo, balloon the note to a huge fortissimo, and then decrescendo all in one breath. Now, on the recording we're going to play from 1923, she hits a very good high C, but it doesn't have any of that elastic quality that Elsa Olsen described. And she made an earlier version in 1917 where she hits a very good high C, but it's not really that terrific. And Raisa was a high C singer. That was for her a very important note. And she knew that people oftentimes waited for the high C, and it was one of her specialties. So we're going to play now the Ritorno Vincitor and the Patria Mia from 1923.
Rosa Raisa, and her biographer is here waiting for your call about her and her soprano contemporaries, and also waiting for requests. We've just heard Rosa Raisa in the arias from Aida. As we approach 11 o'clock, we have a little bit over an hour remaining. And a question that I got a while ago, Charles, was from Jeanette Crissetto. She said she'd like to hear more Giacomo Rimini, but at the same time she said he was not in a class with his wife, Rosa Raisa.
Well, that was generally the rap on him, that although he was a very fine artist with wonderful diction, and that he looked terrific on the stage, but there was the feeling that she carried him. She was clearly the bigger star in the family. In fact, a wonderful family anecdote the daughter told, their daughter, who I met in 1983, who has since unfortunately passed away, her name was Giulietta, and her nickname was Jolly. And Jolly told me that when she was growing up in their home, Rimini would say to Raisa, yes, your star shines brighter, but I'm still the sun and you're only the moon. So there was, and Raisa understood that it wasn't easy for Giacomo, her husband, Giacomo Rimini, to be married to a prima donna who was the star. In fact, in their concerts, she would do 2/3 of the concert and he would do only 1/3. She was clearly the chief attraction. But he was a very famous Falstaff, and he did Falstaff throughout his career. In fact, it's the only time Raisa really sang a role in the major part of her career where she was not the star. In Falstaff, she was only too happy to play Alice Ford, a wonderful role, but clearly it's the baritones. The name of the opera is Falstaff, not Alice Ford. Some of the photographs in the book, there's some wonderful photographs of Rimini when he was young. He was really a very handsome. He was really a very handsome, slim man, and then of course, as time went on, he got rather heavy, and towards the end of his life, he was diabetic. He got very heavy. we're going to now, we've had a request, and it's only logical because if Raisa is thought of as being identified with any role or roles, the four roles that she made her mark on was Aida, of course, Norma, one of the really very important Normas of the century, 20th century, Rachel and La Juive, and an opera that is done no more since she stopped singing, Malalia and Wolf Ferrari's Jewels of the Madonna. At the Chicago Opera, they gave Jewels of the Madonna almost every year. It's a big role for Raisa with high C's and trills and all sorts of things. And there's a great role for Rimini. He plays a mafia lowlife, handsome, debonair, and the photographs I've seen indicates that it must have been quite a sight, the two of them on the stage. But we're going to start with Rosa Ponselle singing the Casta Diva, her famous recording from 1928, I believe.
Well, actually, we can't do that because I don't have that recording here.
Ooh.
So we got to do something else, Charles. How about, why don't we do the Tosca
Okay,
section?
fine. An interesting, Tosca was one of Raisa's big roles, but she's not as historically identified with it as, let's say, Maria Yaritza was. In 1933, Raisa and Rimini, who had been living in Italy for since 1932, after the Chicago Opera collapsed, they took an engagement which was very, very controversial. It was in Berlin in October. There was a group of artists who were advertised as from La Scala, and it included Raisa and Rimini, the great Ebestignani, Arangi Lombardi, Cesare Formici, and Beniamino Gigli. And the centerpiece of their week in Berlin were two Tosca performances, and that was with Raisa, Gigli, and Formici. And at the first performance, which was a gala, Hitler, Goebbels, and Hess sat in a prominent box, and they applauded the Jewish artists. Now, this engagement is only really interesting because of the irony of it, not because you can't read too much politically into it, because it was October 1933. The Nazis had only been in power for a few months, and
well, didn't they think she was Italian?
Yeah, well, that was a big part of it. They just didn't do their biography, their research, and they thought this beautiful woman with a name, Rosa Raisa, it never occurred to them to maybe delve into her background. So that whole engagement is laden with irony. And I think the first selection we're going to play, we're going to sort of recreate that evening, and we're going to play Cesare Formici and Scarpia's.
Actually, first we're going to play Gigli.
Okay. We're going to work a little backwards then. Gigli in the Act 3 aria.
Yes.
E Luce van la Stella.
And that was at the request of Diana Mastroni. She wanted to hear Gigli.
Okay.
Then we'll play Formici in the first aria of the second act. It's A più forte sapore. And then we'll play the Visi d'arte with Raisa.
And this is very interesting. This is recording that Raisa made was in the end of June 1933. It's just July, August, little less than 3 months before the Berlin Tosca. So it's almost a contemporary reading. It shows the state of her voice at that moment in time. And interestingly enough, let me make another point. Gigli, in his post-war memoir, where he generally is just listing operas and casts and famous people that he sang with, sort of breaks the flow of that recitation to single out that particular Tosca performance, because he was clearly aware of the irony, at least after World War II when he wrote the memoir, of the fact that he sang with Raisa in Berlin in the presence of Hitler. It had so many overtones, clearly, and Raisa got a lot of, because of that engagement, she had a lot of problems. The Jewish groups were angry at her. how could you do this? And the truth is, at least in my rationalization, and I may be wrong, is that Raisa and Rimini had been living in Italy since February 1932, after the Chicago Opera collapsed. She was raising her daughter, singing a few engagements, and I think that their information about what was going on in Germany was taken off from Italian newspapers and Italian media, and they maybe just were not aware that Jewish artists were already boycotting Germany. That's my maybe benign interpretation of it, but that's but it is of interest. And anyhow, we're going to play 3 souvenirs from that evening.
We're at 203-268-9667. At 11:06, we've got 54 minutes remaining. Rosa Raisa. From Tosca, which is a role sung by our featured artist Rosa Raisa, began with Beniamino Gigli and E luce ben le stelle. Followed that with baritone Cesare Formichi in the first aria from Act 2, A più forte sapore, and finally our featured artist Rosa Raisa in Vici d'arte.
You know, Doug, there's an interesting story about the Vici d'arte. In doing the research for the book and for an article I did in the English publication Record Collector, we were trying to date specifically the exact date that the recording was made, and it was made June 29th, 1933. And the researcher who had access to the logs of the HMV, or Voce del Padrone company that recorded it in Milan, found a note in their log that Raisa's voice, that she had microphone problems, that it appeared that the voice was too big and that it shattered, and so they put her in the middle of the orchestra. So I always had heard that story years ago, and I assumed it was one of those apocryphal things, but it has been now documented that it's right in the HMV logs. Kind of an amazing fact. However, we just had a souvenir of that weird evening in Berlin, weird because of who was in the audience and on the stage.
All right, now I think in response to your request from Jeanette Corsetto for more duets, you're coming up with
we're going to play
an interesting couple.
Yeah, we're going to play Galli Corci, Amelita Galli Corci, and Tito Schipa in a duet from Sonnambula. In 1916, let's backtrack a little. Raisa made her debut in Chicago in 1913 and was very successful. And had not the war and other factors intervened, she would have come back and built on her successes of 13-14. But she stayed in Europe and South America for 2 years, and when she came back, everything was primed for her to be the big story. This wonderful dramatic soprano who had just had 2 years of blazing successes all over the world. One factor intervened: the North American, and specifically the Chicago debut of Galli Corci. Totally unknown. Raisa had sung with her in South America and had told Campanini, the director of the Chicago Opera, that she was terrific, beautiful voice, wonderful singer. And Caruso had sung with Galli Corci also in South America in 1915, had told Gadi Kazazza that he thought her a mere mediocrity. And the Met, when they were approached by her manager to audition her and think about engaging her, they turned her down. And she went to Chicago as an unknown, and overnight became a huge success. And her debut not only got headlines in Chicago, but all over the United States. It went over the wires. And Galli Corci, and it's interesting, Campanini had told Raisa that Galli Corci's voice was the only one that to him strongly resembled the famous Adelina Patti, whom Campanini had heard quite often in the late 19th century. So a little bit of interesting history. Now, Tito Schipa, of course, came to Chicago in 1920, and he was the leading light lyric tenor until the company collapsed in 32. And he and Galli Corci made this wonderful duet from Sonnambula, and that's what we're going to play now.
Son geloso. The duet Son geloso from Bellini's Sonnambula, Amelita Galli Corci and Tito Schipa. This is the Bellini bicentennial year. He's born in 1801, and our next Bellini program, and last of the year, will be December 11th. Highlights from Beatrice di Tenda and other Bellini operas. Charles Mintzer, we have about 35 minutes to go.
My, how time flies.
On this program commemorating your new biography of Rosa Raisa, coming out next week from Northeastern University Press. Will be available in all good bookstores and online.
We're now going to get to the Norma, and because time is of the essence, we're going to play the Cabaletta from Casta Diva, first with Panzel and then with Raisa. And it's very interesting. When Panzel heard Raisa sing Norma in New York at the Lexington Opera House in 1920, she told friends who had been urging her to study the role, that it was a good fit for her voice. She said she wouldn't touch it because she said she never heard so much coloratura for a dramatic soprano and so many high Cs. However, Panzel was to go on and become one of the very, very greatest Normas of the century. And we're going to play her early recording, rather her 1928 recording of Casta Diva. And the Raisa version we're going to play was recorded in 1929, and it was never published. It was recorded by the Old Brunswick Company, and another jinx on Raisa's career, recording career, the Brunswick Company went belly up just about the time that recording was made, and it was never issued. Ward Marston, the great record restorer,
And all these Raisa recordings, with one exception, are coming from the 3 CD set in Marston, which you wrote the notes for.
Yes. Anyhow, an English collector got a hold of this unpublished recording from a collection that ended up on one of the Scottish islands. The wonderful thing about record collecting is one never knows or knew where things were going to turn up. And a Brunswick recording made in 1929 in New York, never issued, and an important souvenir of Raisa and one of her great assumptions, Norma, turned up in the United Kingdom. Go figure. Doug, let's run the records.
Panzel.
First Panzel and then Raisa. I think, Doug, that those two recordings are good illustrations of placement of voice. Panzel the voice is extremely solid, rich in the middle and bottom, and a little sketchy as it goes to the very top. And Raisa's voice just blossoms on the top, and of course she had that incredible coloratura skill. It's the discovery of that recording started to complete for some of us who have been interested in Raisa the Raisa puzzle. It kind of explained why she was the big star that she was in her day. That recording partially explains it, I think.
Now, Bob Saxon had requested Andrea Chenier, the aria La Mamma Morta, and Muzio's name came up again, I think his request. So we'll lead off with Muzio and then follow with Raisa.
And this is very interesting because even at the Chicago Opera, Muzio sang Andrea Chenier more than Raisa did. However, Raisa used to sing the La Mamma Morta often in concert. The Muzio version was made at the very end of her career in 1935, I believe, and she would have been 46 years old. Raisa is 40 years old on her version. Anyhow, it'll be very interesting to hear the two approaches, both very, very dramatic. Let's roll with it, Doug.
Giordano's Andrea Chenier. We heard two versions of the soprano aria La Mamma Morta. First, Claudia Muzio. Second, Rosa Raisa.
You know, Doug, it's interesting. Both of these sopranos the versions we just played were recorded sort of in the twilight of their respective careers. Both tremendous renditions, so dramatic, and the colors in the voice. Apropos the Raisa recording, when I contacted Paul Hume in the early 60s to elaborate for me about Raisa, whom he had said these glowing things, he said, in that Andrea Chenier recording, he said, have you ever heard any other crescendo in the middle of a note as she does on the Voce Piena d'Armonia? And of course, I hadn't. And I've since looked at the score, because I've listened to all the other versions, why no other soprano does it. And you know why? It's not written that way. But you know, sometimes an artist has an inspired thing and can take a moment beyond what the composer actually wrote and do something that brings it to yet another level. Anyhow, those two recordings were really quite wonderful. And you can't talk about Rosa Raisa and the Chicago Opera without mentioning the great Mary Garden. Now,
the director.
Yes, and there's a whole bunch of stories which are in the book, but in 1921-22, Garden was made the director of the Chicago Opera. She said she wanted to be called director, not director. She and Raisa had a kind of interesting relationship. Professionally, of course, very respectful of each other and always said the right things, but on a personal level, there was not really that much warmth. And when Mary Garden was the director of the opera company, newspaper reporters would ask Raisa, well, how does it feel to be singing for a woman director? And she said, well, what difference does it make, a woman or a man, Gatti Casazza or Mary Garden? The question isn't whether it's a woman or a man, it's whether they know their job. And she said Mary Garden knows her job. And she said that Mary Garden, like American women of that generation who were liberated and advanced, she said she could be the president of the United States or the general of an army. She was that brilliant. Garden was a very colorful personality, and of course several books have been written about her. And I have a whole chapter in my book called Mary Garden. It's basically covers that couple years of Raisa's career when Garden was the director. I thought a nice touch would be to play Garden's recording of the wonderful song Annie Laurie, recorded in the late 20s. She's well into her 50s at this point, but God, what beautiful singing.
Garden's recording of Annie Laurie. Well, Charles, we've had a wonderful evening.
Well, I think we should close, Doug, with the recording that many people feel is Raisa's masterpiece, the L'altra Notte from Mephistopheles. But just for comparative sake, we're going to play first Claudia Muzio's 1922 version, and then we'll play Raisa's 1923 version. And it's very interesting. In 1914, when both singers were at the start of their careers, they did Mephistopheles in London at Covent Garden with Muzio as the Margherita and Raisa as the Helen of Troy. We're going to play these two versions, first the Muzio, and then we're going to close the evening with the Raisa, and I think the reason why so many commentators over the years have felt that this was her masterpiece is that the voice sounds just naturally very large, very rangy, very, very secure high notes, of course, and she sings the trills, which many singers can only suggest. She actually gives you full oscillations on the trills. So we're going to close the evening with the Mephistopheles.
Well, this has been a wonderful evening, Charles.
Well, thank you.
I know a number of listeners have commented that they are looking forward to the imminent appearance of your book, Rosa Raisa, published by Northeastern University Press. It's going to be available at all bookstores and online. And I've read it in manuscript with all the photos, and it's quite a contribution of which you can be justly proud.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the listeners for putting up with 4 hours of sopranos mostly, but
Well, I don't think it was burdensome at all.
okay. Anyhow,
And we'll say our goodbyes now, and then play the L'Alternote by Muzio, and then by Raisa. I'll be back next week with Verdi's Stifilio, and remember that when the opera singers are done, that doesn't mean the music is done. The music never stops here on Fine Arts Radio. Charles, thank you.
thank you very much, Doug, and the listeners of this station.